He suspects us, Roger. We must deal with him before he becomes...
Under a sky thick with smoke, and the sound of bells tolling across medieval London, a king's breath fades away. It is June 21st, 1477, and the man once called the Lion of England lies dying at Sheen Palace. His silver hair sticks to his damp forehead, his lips moving faintly as he whispers his last words. I have reigned long enough. The servants weep. The nobles kneel. And the city beyond the walls holds its breath. Edward of Windsor, crowned at 14, warrior of Halidon Hill, conqueror of Crissy, and founder of the Order of the Garter, is gone. But what he leaves behind will outlive empires. For 50 years, his shadow stretched across Europe. He was the boy king who overthrew his mother's lover in the night. The soldier who turned farmers into an army that humbled France. The ruler who stared down plague and famine, and somehow transformed disaster into the foundation of a nation. Before him, England was a battered island, licking its wounds after his father's disgrace. After him, it was a superpower wealthy, feared, and suddenly aware of its own identity. His reign would change not just kingship, but the very idea of what it meant to be English. Imagine being that boy in the frozen halls of Windsor, the year 1327, shivering under furs, while the crown still weighs too heavy for his skull. Outside, snow buries the countryside. Inside, whispers echo through the stone corridors. His mother, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, plotting in candlelight. The boy listens, wide-eyed, learning that kingship is not inherited, it must be taken. 3 years later, he does exactly that. Under cover of night, through tunnels carved into Nottingham's rock, he storms into his mother's chambers, sword in hand, and drags Mortimer to his knees. From this day, he says, voice shaking but certain, I rule in my own name. It is the birth of a legend. Edward grows into a commander who fights like a man born in armor. At Halidon Hill, at just 21, he faces an army nearly 3 times his size. Rain soaks the banners. Arrows fly like storms. And by dusk, the ground runs red with Scottish blood. Then comes the thunder of the sea at Sluys, where he leads England's first great naval battle and sinks 200 French ships. His longbowmen turn the tide of war, a new kind of weapon for a new kind of king. And at Crissy, his victory becomes myth. The French knights, glittering like mirrors in the sun, charge uphill into a wall of English arrows that fall so thick they blot out the sky. Beside him, his 16-year-old son, the Black Prince, earns his spurs amid the carnage. Father and son stand together over fields littered with thousands of corpses. France will never forget that day, but glory has a price. The triumphs abroad drain the coffers at home, and the Black Death sweeps across England like a biblical curse. Towns empty, crops rot in the fields, whole villages vanish. One of his daughters dies before reaching Spain, yet Edward does not crumble. When priests preach doom, he answers with law. He reforms the coinage, regulates wages, builds systems of local justice institutions so solid they will last for centuries, out of plague and panic. He forges the first modern state. He is also the king of spectacle. He rebuilds Windsor Castle into a fortress palace that shines with banners and gold. He founds the Order of the Garter, a brotherhood of knights sworn to honor and loyalty, its motto whispering through the ages, shame on him who thinks evil of it. It is his way of binding England's proudest nobles not by fear, but by belonging. Around his throne gather poets, soldiers, architects, and dreamers. Even language bends to his will. He decrees that English, not French, shall be the tongue of law and parliament, making the words of the people, the words of power. For half a century, Edward dominates his world. He captures the King of France at Poitiers, imprisons the King of Scotland at Durham, and makes England the terror of Europe. When he walks through London, the crowds roar as if witnessing the return of King Arthur himself. He is the first monarch to call himself ruler of both England and France. And though that dream will fade, its echo will shape every English ambition for empire to come. Yetim spares no man, not even the greatest. His beloved Queen Philippa dies. His brilliant son wastes away, and the fire that once roared behind his eyes dims to embers. In the end, he drifts through fogs of confusion, an old lion surrounded by courtiers who whisper of the past. When he dies, London weeps not just for a king, but for an age that believed it could conquer the world. 7 centuries later, his tomb still lies in Westminster Abbey, gilded and serene. Tourists trace the cold bronze of his face, unaware that the world around them, the language they speak, the parliament they elect, the very sense of Englishness they carry was shaped by this single man, Edward III. The boy who took his throne by the sword, who fought like thunder, who outlived plague and defeat, and who built a kingdom that endures long after the echoes of his battles have faded. This is the story of that boy and the empire he dreamed into being. The child who became a conqueror, the conqueror who became a builder, the builder who became a legend. This is the tale of Edward III, the boy who stole the crown and built a nation from fire. The nights ahead will tell his story slowly, vividly, as if you were there in the cold chambers of Windsor or on the blood-soaked hills of France, how a teenager's fury reshaped a kingdom, and how the echoes of his reign still hum beneath the stones of England today. The night wind whispers against the windows of Windsor Castle, carrying the faint sound of crows over frozen fields. The year is 1327, and England has a new king. Edward of Windsor is 14 years old, crowned not by victory, but by treachery. His father, Edward II, lies imprisoned, a fallen king whose reign ended in humiliation and whispers of murder. His mother, Isabella of France, rules in his place, her cold beauty masking ambition sharper than any blade. Roger Mortimer, her lover and the real master of the realm, sits beside her at council while the boy king is made to watch and learn. Every decree is issued in his name, every coin minted with his face. Yet his voice means nothing. Still, within the pale glow of torchlight, something inside him begins to stir a quiet, patient anger that will one day ignite into revolution. Life at court moves with the rhythm of deceit. Feasts fill the great hall with the smell of roasted venison and the heavy sweetness of spiced wine. But beneath the laughter lies fear. The courtiers bow to the boy, but their eyes flick nervously toward Mortimer, who wields the real power. Edward understands more than they think. He listens in silence as decisions are made about wars and taxes, about men's lives and women's fates, and he learns what kind of ruler he will never be. At night, as frost creeps up the castle walls, he lies awake staring at the carved beams above his bed and repeats the same vow again and again. One day, the crown will truly belong to me. His mother calls him Mon Fils, her voice soft but distant. A queen who has long forgotten how to be a mother. She is radiant and dangerous, the daughter of a French king, the woman who defied her husband and took England by storm. But power changes love into something brittle, and Mortimer's presence poisons what remains between them. Edward watches her eyes shift toward the man beside her, how her voice trembles slightly when Mortimer speaks, how she obeys without argument. He learns early that affection and loyalty rarely live in the same house. It is a hard lesson, but one that will shape every choice he makes as a man. When the first campaign against the Scots fails miserably, the humiliation burns deeper than frostbite. Edward rides at the head of the army, but only as a figure for others to command. Mortimer makes the decisions, and the Scots mock them from across the border. They strike by night, ghostly riders who set tents ablaze and vanish into the mist. One night, their torches flicker so close that the king's own tent collapses around him. He wakes choking on smoke and fury, a boy king dragged from the embers by his guards. Hearing the laughter of the enemy fade into the distance, that night will never leave him. He learns that fear tastes like iron in the mouth, and that shame is a fire no crown can extinguish. The years pass, and the boy grows taller, stronger, harder. Beaitian, he carries himself like a man carved from oak, his eyes steady, his jaw set with quiet defiance. England is restless. Nobles whisper that Mortimer bleeds the treasury dry, that the Queen's lover acts like a king. The people mutter prayers mixed with curses. Edward says little, but in secret he gathers loyal men, young knights who still believe in honour, old soldiers who remember better days. Among them is William Montague, fierce and loyal, who becomes the king's shadow. Together, they begin to weave the plot that will change everything. It happens one October night in Nottingham Castle, under a moon thin as a blade. The Queen and Mortimer sleep in chambers guarded by men who think no one would dare approach. But the boy who once trembled under furs now wears mail under his cloak. Guided by torchlight and the sound of dripping water, Edward and his companions descend into the secret tunnels carved beneath the rock. The air is cold and thick with damp earth, the silence broken only by their breath and the faint clink of steel. Somewhere above, a torch guttering in a corridor sends a single thread of smoke curling through the cracks. They emerge behind the royal apartments, blades drawn, hearts hammering. The door bursts open with a crack of splintering wood. Mortimer leaps from the bed, reaching for his sword. But Edward is faster. "By what right do you rule my kingdom?" he demands, the voice of a man echoing from the body of youth. The struggle is brief. Guards fall. Mortimer is dragged to the ground, and Isabella's cry rings out a mother's plea and a queen's terror joined in one. Edward's face is pale in the torchlight, but his eyes are steady as stone. "Mother," he says quietly, "your time is done." At dawn, the castle bells toll. Mortimer is chained and taken to London, where a scaffold awaits him at Tyburn. Crowds gather to watch the fall of the man who once ruled England. The air smells of mud and smoke, of vengeance and wet wool. When the executioner lifts his axe, Edward does not look away. He has seen enough of shadows. From that moment, he is king, not by name, but by will. Isabella is spared death but sent into lifelong confinement. In the silence of her exile, the boy she once controlled becomes a ruler the world will remember. Power, once seized, must be proved. Edward's first test comes from the north. Scotland, that stubborn thorn in every English king's crown, defies him still. He rides to war not as a puppet but as a lion unchained. The year is 1333 when he stands at Halidon Hill, the wind whipping across the fields, the enemy glittering in armour below. He studies the slope, the mud, the way the light glints off the steel tips of his archers' arrows. When he gives the signal, the sky darkens. The storm that follows is made not of rain, but of death. When it clears, Scotland lies broken, and England roars its approval. The boy who once hid from battle now commands it. From that victory, Edward's legend begins to take shape. He reforms his armies, studies tactics like scripture, and dreams of reclaiming France itself, the land of his mother and his blood. In the courts of Europe, they start to whisper his name with awe and fear. He is no longer the shadow of his father or the pawn of his mother. He is Edward, King of England, the hammer of his enemies, the architect of his own destiny. And yet, in the quiet after battle, when the armor is removed and the campfire burns low, he sometimes remembers the chill of that first winter as king. The way his mother's voice echoed through the stone corridors, the smell of frost and betrayal. It is that memory, more than any crown or victory, that keeps him awake at night. Because beneath the banners, beneath the glory, he still carries the heart of that 14-year-old boy who swore he would never be a puppet again. The path before him stretches toward blood and brilliance, toward empires and plagues, toward a destiny that will crown him as one of the greatest kings who ever lived. But for now, as the fires of Nottingham fade into the dawn, he stands on the threshold of his own, becoming young, untested, and utterly unstoppable. The dawn that rises after Nottingham glows red against the castle walls, a colour that feels both like victory and warning. England wakes to a new reality. The boy who once bowed to others now rules alone. The nobles whisper the word coup, but behind their murmurs lies something else: respect. Edward III, not yet 20, has done what few kings ever dared, seized his throne with his own hands. The chill morning air carries the sound of church bells, tolling both for the death of Roger Mortimer and the birth of a true king. It is the first day of Edward's reign in truth. And already, the kingdom feels as if it is breathing again after years of suffocation. He rides through London beneath grey skies, the crowd pressing close to see the face of the monarch who has toppled his mother's tyrant. The air smells of wet straw and smoke, of horses and rain. But above all, it smells of hope. Some cheer, some cross themselves, unsure what kind of ruler this young man will be. But all agree that at last, England belongs to its king again. Mortimer's head is displayed on London Bridge, a warning to traitors and a promise to the loyal. The Queen Mother is confined far from court, and for the first time in his life, Edward feels the weight of the crown settle upon his head, not as a burden, but as a weapon. Yet freedom brings its own trials. The kingdom he inherits is weary and poor. The nobles bicker like crows over scraps of land and pride. Scotland remains defiant in the north. And across the sea, France eyes England's weakness, with greed disguised as courtesy. Edward sits at his council table in Westminster, fingers tracing the carved lions that decorate the wood, listening as his advisors speak of debts, of famine, of lost honour. He is patient but restless, the blood in his veins still hot from battle and vengeance. He has learned how to seize power. Now he must learn how to wield it. That lesson begins on the cold fields of Berwick. It is spring of 1333, and the air tastes of sea salt and iron. The town of Berwick, caught between England and Scotland like a bone between dogs, becomes the proving ground of Edward's young rule. He commands the siege himself, his banners of crimson and gold fluttering above rows of tents pitched in the mud. The Scottish garrison within the walls holds out, taunting the English with songs and insults shouted from the battlements. Edward's temper flares, but he has learned the virtue of patience from years of watching others fail. "Let hunger fight for us," he tells his captains. It never betrays its master. Days turn to weeks, and the siege tightens like a noose. The Scots send for aid, and Edward knows the rescue will come. He welcomes it. A king needs not just victory, but spectacle. And what better stage than the green slopes of Halidon Hill, on the morning of battle. Mist curls along the river, shrouding the world in grey silence. Then the trumpets sound, and from the fog emerges the Scottish host, twice the size of his own. Edward positions his men on the high ground, the longbowmen stretching their lines like drawn strings ready to sing. What follows is slaughter. The Scottish knights charge uphill into a rain of arrows, so thick it turns the sky black. The sound is not that of battle, but of breaking. Wood and bone, and we're all splintering together. By dusk, the hillside is strewn with corpses, the English banners unbloodied against the wind. Edward stands among his men, his armour spattered with mud, his face pale beneath the crown of his helmet. For the first time, the soldiers see not the boy from Windsor, but the Lion of England, and they kneel in the trampled grass to cheer him. Halidon Hill changes everything. The nobles who once doubted him now compete for his favour. The chroniclers call him the new Arthur, and the songs of victory echo from taverns to cathedrals. But Edward's hunger is not for praise, it is for greatness. He knows that glory on the battlefield can win the hearts of men, but only legacy can hold a kingdom. He begins to shape the government into something stronger, more efficient, more his. Taxes are collected with precision, trade routes secured, and laws rewritten to remind England that order begins at the throne. For the first time since his grandfather, Edward I, the realm feels whole. Yet peace is a fragile thing. Across the channel, his mother's brother, the King of France, watches England's rise with unease. When the French crown seizes English lands in Aquitaine and supports Scotland's resistance, Edward's blood boils. Diplomats urge caution. But kings raised in fire do not fear the flame. In the year 1337, he makes a declaration that will shake the world for 100 years. He claims the throne of France itself. By right of my mother's blood, he proclaims, I am the true heir of France. His seal is struck with a new design, 3 lions of England joined by the fleur-de-lis of France, and the war that will define centuries begins. The first blows are struck at sea. It is June 1340, and the English fleet sails toward the French coast under grey skies heavy with promise. The king stands on the deck, chainmail gleaming, the wind snapping the royal banner above him. Ahead, near the port of Sluys, the French fleet waits 200 ships chained together like a floating fortress. Edward's ships number fewer, but he knows the strength of his new weapon, the English longbow. When he gives the signal, the sea itself seems to hiss with arrows. The French ships crumble under the storm of fire, their decks slick with blood and seawater. The roar of victory carries across the waves as Edward's men cheer their king, who fought beside them rather than behind them. By dusk, the Channel belongs to England. When the news reaches London, church bells ring from every tower. The people call him King of the Sea. His enemies call him the Hammer. But even in triumph, Edward knows that war is not won by one battle or one year. The French throne lies far beyond the horizon, and to reach it will take more than courage. It will take endurance, patience, and the will to outlast fate itself. That night, as his ship rocks gently in the dark waters, Edward leans against the rail and watches the moon shimmer across the waves. Around him, the deck smells of tar and salt, of men's sweat and the faint copper tang of blood. He thinks of Windsor, of the boy who once lay awake in the cold, dreaming of freedom. That boy has become a conqueror, yet beneath the armour, beneath the triumph, there remains a strange quiet, a flicker of loneliness only kings can know. He has won power beyond measure, but he also understands the truth. His father never did that. A crown is not a prize, but a storm. Soon, that storm will sweep across France. bringing with it victories that will make his name immortal and losses that will carve his heart in stone. But for now, as the English banners ripple in the night breeze and the tide carries the scent of salt and smoke, Edward III stands alone at the bow. Staring into the darkness, he intends to conquer. The boy who took back his crown is now the man who will reach for an empire. And the world, though it does not know it yet, is about to burn. The summer of 1346 breaks over the fields of Normandy like the opening of a furnace. Dust hangs in the air as Edward's army marches south. 30,000 men in iron and leather, under the relentless sun. The long grass bends beneath their boots, their banners fluttering like living fire. England has come to France, and the king leads from the front, golden-haired and iron-hearted, the embodiment of war itself. Behind him rides his eldest son, the young Prince of Wales, barely 16 but already armoured like a legend. They call him the Black Prince for the darkness of his armour, but also for the shadow. He casts across the battlefield a shadow that will one day swallow kings. Edward has spent 6 years preparing for this moment, gathering ships, forging alliances, and studying every failure of the kings who came before him. Now, as his army cuts through the countryside, leaving a trail of burning villages and shattered pride, he sees what power truly looks like. Each blaze that rises into the sky is a message to France. The Lion of England has crossed the sea, and he will not leave until his claim is written in blood. The French king, Philip of Valois, scrambles to gather his forces, but Edward moves like thunder, striking where least expected, vanishing before the enemy can respond. He is no longer fighting for survival, he is fighting for history. The English reach the town of Caen, rich and defiant. Its towers glitter in the distance, its gates guarded by French knights whose arrogance matches their armour. Edward orders the assault at dawn. The sky blushes with fire before the first trumpet sounds, and when it does, it's as if the world itself shudders. His men pour through the breaches like a tide, their cries mingling with the clang of steel. For 2 days, Caen resists, then breaks. The loot is staggering gold. Wine, silk, and captives worth more than castles. The town burns behind them, its reflection dancing across the river like a second sun. To the French, it is a nightmare. To the English, it is prophecy fulfilled. But Edward knows that plunder alone will not crown him in Paris. His real battle lies ahead. The French king gathers an army twice his size, determined to crush the invader before he can escape. The chase becomes a deadly race across France. Villages stripped bare, bridges burned, rivers crossed under storms of arrows. The men march until their feet bleed. Horses collapse. The air reeks of smoke and sweat, of hunger and fear. Yet Edward presses on, his eyes always fixed forward. He knows what he is doing. He is not running from the French, he is leading them. At last, he halts near the small village of Crécy. Close to the river Somme, the land slopes gently downward toward a stream, flanked by woods that protect his flanks. He surveys it like a painter studying a blank canvas and smiles. "Here," he says softly, "we will make history." His captains nod, though they see only exhaustion. Edward see destined. He arranges his men in 3 divisions, one led by his son, another by the Earl of Northampton, and the last by himself. The archers take their places, their bows taller than their bodies, their arrows sharpened and bound in sheaves. The knights dismount to fight on foot, a strange thing for noblemen. But the king's command is law. By the next afternoon, the horizon darkens with the approach of the French. It is a sight that could chill even the bravest heart. Tens of thousands of men, their armor gleaming like scales of a dragon, their banners snapping in the wind, trumpets blare, hooves churn the earth, and the French advance in chaos and pride. Edward's men wait in silence. Then the king lifts his hand, and 1,000 bowstrings draw. The air trembles. The sky grows dim, and when the arrows fall, they fall like rain from the heavens. Horses scream. Men collapse. The first French wave shatters before it even reaches the English lines. The second wave comes, and the third, each more desperate than the last. The field turns into a living graveyard. Mud and blood, merging beneath the weight of dying men. The Black Prince fights at the center, his sword rising and falling, his armor blackened with soot and gore. When his banner wavers, a messenger rides to the king. Your son is hard-pressed. Sire. Shall we send aid? Edward watches the battlefield. The smoke, the chaos, and then shakes his head. Let him win his spurs today. He says quietly, he must learn what it means to command. It is a moment that will echo for centuries. A father's trust, a prince's trial, and the birth of a legend. By nightfall, the French army is destroyed. Their king flees the field, and thousands of nobles lie dead among their soldiers. The English lose barely a few hundred men. The stars rise over Crecy, and Edward walks among the corpses, his face expressionless. Around him, the moans of the dying fill the night air. He does not rejoice. He does not pray. He simply looks, as if memorizing the cost of greatness. The Black Prince kneels before him, blood streaking his cheek, and Edward places a hand on his son's shoulder. You have fought as a king should, he murmurs. One day, you will rule as one. The victory at Crecy sends tremors through Europe. The old order of knights and honor shatters beneath the weight of English arrows. Edward has rewritten the rules of war. France reels, its pride broken, its fields ravaged, its nobles slaughtered. But Edward's ambition does not rest. He turns his eyes to the coast, to the fortress city of Calais, a jewel on the edge of the sea. We will take it, he tells his men, and it will never return to French hands. The siege of Calais begins in autumn and drags on for nearly a year. The French garrison holds, starving but defiant. Edward builds an entire city of tents around the walls, complete with markets, forges, and taverns. Winter comes, and the cold gnaws at the living as fiercely as the hunger kills the trapped. Edward walks the lines wrapped in furs, speaking to his soldiers, promising them victory. Hold fast, he says. The sea is ours, and soon the land will be too. By summer, the defenders can endure no longer. The gates open, and 6 burghers, the wealthiest citizens of Calais, walk barefoot through the dust, ropes around their necks, begging for mercy. The crowd falls silent. Even Edward hesitates, his eyes unreadable. Then, from behind him, his queen steps forward, Philippa of Hainaut, heavy with child, her face pale but determined. My lord, she says softly, kneeling before him. I beg you, in the name of the child I carry, show mercy to these men. The king studies her for a long moment, then nods. The ropes are cut, the burghers spared, and the world whispers of the mercy of an English king and the grace of his queen. When Calais finally falls, Edward does not destroy it. He empties it. The French inhabitants are driven out, replaced by English settlers. The city becomes his gateway to the continent, a scar carved into France that will never heal. As he stands on the ramparts, watching the English flag rise above the harbour, He feels the wind of the Channel whip against his face. Cool and salt and infinite. Behind him lies a land torn apart by his ambition. Before him, the sea that carries his destiny. He closes his eyes, and for a moment, he feels the weight of both glory and burden, victory and grief pressing on his shoulders. He knows this is only the beginning. For every crown won, another waits to be taken, and every victory calls to him like a siren in the dark. As the sun sets over Calais, the King of England turns from the sea and mounts his horse. The wind catches the edge of his cloak, and for a heartbeat, he looks like something more than mortal, a man carved out of myth, a king born not of blood, but of will. Behind him, the waves crash endlessly, as if saluting their new master. The boy who once stole back his crown now stands as the ruler of nations, the architect of an empire written in fire and iron. And though he cannot know it yet, the greatest trial of his reign, the one enemy no sword can slay, has already begun to cross the sea toward him. Unseen and unstoppable, the winter after Calais tastes of victory and salt. England roars with pride. The bells of London never seem to stop ringing. In every tavern and church, men speak the same name, Edward III, the king who conquered France and mastered the sea. The poets call him the new Alexander. The people call him the Father of Glory. Yet even as the crowds cheer, the king himself grows quiet. From the walls of Windsor, he watches snow fall across the countryside and thinks not of crowns, but of what comes after conquest. For war is a storm that feeds on triumph, and storms, once loosed, never truly end. He spends the early months of 1348 in solemn labour. The treasury is empty, the men weary, the ships in need of repair. Victory has made England powerful, but power devours gold faster than it breeds peace. Edward orders new reforms, taxes reorganised, coinage purified. Trade through Calais expanded until the harbour fills with the smell of wool and salt. Windsor itself transforms under his will. The old Norman keep becomes a palace fit for a god. Its towers polished white, its great halls lined with banners from every battle he has won. A king's buildings must outlive his wars. He tells his masons, when the swords are rusted, the stones will still speak. In those same years, the seeds of something greater take root in his mind. A brotherhood bound not by birth but by honour. One night, as a storm rages outside, he sits before the fire with his knights and speaks of a dream. Let there be an order, he says, a circle of loyalty and courage, equal in chivalry, where each man's virtue crowns the other. They nod in silence, understanding that this is not just ceremony but vision. Out of that vision comes the Order of the Garter, 26 knights, chosen by the king himself. Their blue ribbons and golden emblems, a sign that they serve something larger than power. Shame on him who thinks evil of it, reads their motto, a whisper of pride that will echo for centuries. But just as Edward builds his immortal circle, another begins one that will darken the world. In the spring of that same year, ships from the south bring rumours more terrible than war. A sickness, they say, a black death that eats cities whole. It has devoured Sicily, crossed the Alps, reached Paris. No wall can keep it out. No priest can bless it away. The merchants who land at the English coast tell of bodies piled like driftwood, and towns where the bells ring for no one left alive to hear them. Edward listens in silence. He has seen battlefields carpeted in corpses. But this is different. A sword you can parry, an army you can outthink. But how do you fight air by summer? The rumours become truth. The plague crawls across England like a shadow that breathes. It enters through the ports, spreading inland, riding on rats and wind. Villagers vanish in days. Priests die beside their flocks. Doctors beside their patients. The court flees London, seeking cleaner air in the hills. Death follows. It strikes rich and poor alike, noble and servant, saint and sinner. The smell of burning herbs fills the roads. Fires burn in every town square, meant to cleanse the air of evil. Yet still the coughing continues. And still the black swellings rise on necks and thighs like the mark of doom itself. Edward loses his daughter Joan that year. She is 14, radiant and kind, betrothed to a prince of Castile. She never makes it across the channel. The messenger who brings the news cannot meet the king's eyes. She took fever in Bordeaux. He whispers. By the third day, she was gone. The words fall like stones into silence. Edward dismisses the court and walks alone in the gardens of Windsor until dawn. The frost hard beneath his boots. He does not weep where anyone can see. But the next morning, his beard is wet with dew. That is not dew. For all his victories, for all his power, he cannot save what he loves. When the plague reaches London, the city becomes a cemetery. The air grows thick with smoke from burning homes. Graves overflow. Bodies are thrown into pits by the hundreds. The chroniclers write that in some places, not even the crows remain to pick the bones. Edward orders new burial grounds, new laws to govern the chaos, new measures to keep the realm from tearing itself apart. If the hand of God strikes, then we must be his fingers, holding what remains. He says to his council, he creates justices of the peace men who will govern locally in the king's name, bringing order where government cannot reach. It is an invention born from despair, yet it will endure for centuries. The Black Death changes England more deeply than any battle. With so many dead, the living demand more. Peasants refuse to work for the old wages. Craftsmen abandon their lords to seek better fortune elsewhere. The world is turned upside down. Grumbles, one baron, but Edward, ever the pragmatist, sees what others fear, to see that change can be harnessed. In 1351, he signs the Statute of Labourers, fixing wages and forbidding workers from leaving their homes without permission. Harsh as it is, the law steadies the realm, prevents total collapse, and teaches a lesson that will define his rule, control the chaos, or be consumed by it. When at last the pestilence begins to fade, the survivors crawl from the ruins like ghosts reborn. Fields bloom again. Bells toll for weddings instead of burials. Edward rides through London as he once did in his youth. And though the cheers are fewer, they are deeper, more grateful. The people have seen death itself, and found their king still standing. They begin to call him not only the conqueror, but the survivor. In every cathedral, they pray for him by name. He is no longer just a man of war, he has become the embodiment of endurance. And yet, even after so much loss, he refuses to surrender to sorrow. At Windsor, he renews the works of beauty. He began before the plague. The chapel grows, its stones carved with angels whose faces seem almost human in their weariness. The court fills once more with laughter and music. Tournaments resume bright armor, gleaming under sunlight. Horses pounding the earth. Banners fluttering like memories of youth. To some, it seems callous. To others, it is salvation. Edward understands what few rulers do, that a kingdom cannot live on grief alone. Let them see joy. He tells Queen Philippa, and they will remember life again. But beneath the feasts and music, a darker rhythm beats. France has not forgotten its humiliation. Its new king, Charles of Navarre, sharpens his armies and waits for revenge. The truce that followed the plague will not last. Even now, spies cross the channel, with letters sealed in wax and treachery. The King of England stands on his tower, looking toward the dark water that separates him from his enemies. And he feels the pull of destiny once more. The sea whispers. The wind smells of salt and smoke. And somewhere deep inside him, the old fire begins to stir. The plague has tested his soul and left it tempered like steel. His daughter lies in foreign soil, his people scarred, his realm reshaped by suffering. But Edward has survived every storm, and that survival has made him something more than mortal. As he watches the sun sink into the channel, he whispers to the waves, "England will not fade." The wind catches his cloak. The horizon glows blood red, and the king who has faced death itself smiles faintly at the promise of another war. The years after the plague roll forward like a weary tide, washing away death but leaving its scars behind. England breathes again, though every field and village carries ghosts in its soil. The survivors rebuild, hands calloused and hearts harder. And through it all, Edward watches his kingdom mend itself beneath a sky that seems at once purer and colder. He has known the ecstasy of victory and the silence of loss. And now, as the world reawakens, he turns from mourning toward creation. The realm that survived pestilence must be reforged, not by fear but by vision. It begins with language. In the spring of 1362, the king gathers his council in Westminster Hall, sunlight spilling through the stained glass like molten gold across the floor. The air is thick with incense and debate. The nobles, still half French in tongue and manner, speak of law and trade, in words borrowed from their ancestors across the sea. Edward listens, his fingers drumming the carved lions on the throne. Then, quietly but firmly, he says, "From this day forward, English shall be the language of the law." The court stills. For 300 years since William the Conqueror, French has been the speech of judgment and power. But Edward knows what the plague has already begun to prove, that the strength of a nation lies not in the tongue of its conquerors, but in the voice of its people. The decree spreads through the realm like fire on dry grass. Judges, scribes, and sheriffs begin to write in English, not French. And suddenly the language of peasants becomes the language of kings. The chroniclers will later call it the moment England found its voice. To Edward, it is simply sense. He has seen how blood unites men in battle. Now he learns how words can unite them in peace. "Let no man speak for England in a tongue she does not know," he says. And from that command grows an identity that will outlive every war he wages. Peace, for a while, feels possible. The fields are green again. The church is rebuilt, and the laughter that once died in the plague years returns cautiously to the streets. Windsor Castle hums with life, a palace of light rising from the ashes of darkness. Edward walks the gardens with Queen Philippa, her hair silver now, but her eyes bright as the day he first met her. She has been his companion through every storm, through rebellion, conquest, plague, and mourning. When he looks at her, he sees not just the woman who softened his heart, but the reason England never lost its soul. Together they attend the feasts of the Order of the Garter, where knights wear ribbons of blue and speak of honour, as if it were a sacred faith. The king watches them with quiet pride. These men, once wild and ambitious, now stand united under a code he created. They feast, they laugh, they remember fallen comrades, and for one golden moment, England feels whole. It is a peace so deep that it almost feels fragile, as though the air itself holds its breath. But peace never lasts long in the life of a conqueror. Across the Channel, France stirs once more. Its new king, Charles V, shrewder than his predecessors, rebuilds his armies in silence, learning from the defeats of Crécy and Calais. He does not seek open battle. Instead, he waits, watching England grow complacent. Edward knows what is coming. The old fire flickers inside him again, though it burns slower now. Tempered by age, he is nearing 60, his once golden hair streaked with white, his shoulders still broad, but bent beneath invisible weight. The body tires, but the will remains steel. Before war returns, fate deals him another blow. In the summer of 1369, Queen Philippa falls ill. At first it is a fever, then a lingering weakness that no prayer can mend. Edward sits at her bedside in Windsor, the chamber thick with the scent of roses and candle wax. She smiles faintly at him, her hand cool against his. "Stay with me," she whispers, and for once the king who conquered armies feels powerless. He promises he will never leave her side, and he keeps that promise until the end. On an August morning, as the bells toll softly in the courtyard below, Philippa breathes her last. Edward closes her eyes himself, his hand trembling for the first time in years. "When my time comes," he murmurs to the still air, "lay me beside her." Her death leaves a silence that nothing fills. The court grows duller, the feasts shorter, the laughter forced. Even the wind through Windsor's halls sounds hollow. Edward moves through his palace like a ghost of his former self, pausing before tapestries that once showed triumphs but now feel like memories. Yet grief never fully conquers him. Instead, it carves him into something new, quieter, wiser, more human. He spends his evenings by the window, watching the sun sink behind the Thames, thinking of the strange arc of his life. From the boy who toppled his mother's tyrant to the ruler of empires, from the father who buried a daughter to the husband who buried his queen, he has learned that kingship is not glory, it is endurance. And endurance will soon be tested again. France strikes first, tearing apart the fragile peace. Charles V claims that Edward has broken the Treaty of Bretagne. French banners rise once more along the coasts of Aquitaine. Edward's sons, seasoned by years of war, answer the call. The Black Prince rides south, his armor darker than the night sky, his body already weakened by illness, but his spirit unbowed. John of Gaunt, bold and ambitious, commands the north. For a time, it seems the old rhythm of victory will return. But France has changed. Its armies no longer charge blindly into the arrows. They melt into the countryside, harassing, starving, vanishing. The war that once blazed like fire now drags like winter rain endless, cold and consuming. Edward watches the reports pile upon his table. Villages burned, supply lines cut, the treasury bleeding again. His son's right of exhaustion, of sickness, of men too old or too young to fight. The king's own body betrays him. Pain gnaws at his bones. And there are days when even rising from bed feels like lifting a mountain. But he refuses to surrender to weakness. A crown does not rest, he tells his attendants, forcing himself to stand, to sign, to lead. It must burn until the head beneath it turns to ash. The war drags on, a slow unraveling of the glory that once defined him. The Black Prince returns home ill and hollow-eyed, coughing blood, his strength fading. The father who once sent his son to earn his spurs at Crécy now watches helplessly as disease steals him away. "He was my right hand," Edward whispers one night, staring at the empty chair beside his throne. "Without him, I am only half a king." Yet even as grief circles him again, he refuses to let despair claim his reign. He reforms his armies, strengthens parliament, and holds the realm together by sheer force of will. By 1371, he is an old man in a young man's world. His counselors argue, his sons scheme, his enemies press harder. He moves more slowly now, leaning on a staff carved with the image of a lion. But when he enters the great hall, silence still falls. The aura of kingship hard-earned, battle-forged, has never left him. The younger courtiers whisper that he is fading. They do not see the fire still alive in his eyes. They will learn soon enough that even in twilight, the sun can burn. In the evenings, he sits before the hearth and speaks softly to the memory of his queen, as if she still listens. He tells her of the realm she helped him build, of the English tongue that now fills the courts, of the laws that hold the villages together, of the men who still raise banners in his name. We have made something that will outlast us, he says to the flames. Outside, winter gathers again, and the wind wails against the stones like the cry of time itself. But within the fortress of Windsor, Edward III warrior, whitherwhere, King endures, his spirit as unyielding as the walls he raised. For though his body weakens, his will remains, the iron heart of a kingdom reborn from death. And somewhere in that unbroken resolve lies the final truth of his greatness, that even as the night deepens, he continues to stand, holding the line between the past he conquered and the future he will never see. The autumn of 1372 drapes England in grey. The once sparkling realm now moves with a slower heartbeat, its king aging, its glory dimming like the embers of a long-burning fire. Edward sits at Windsor, his joints stiff, his breath uneven. Yet his mind, when it clears, is still sharp as tempered steel. His courtiers speak softly now, afraid that the echo of footsteps might rouse the temper of a lion in pain. The once mighty warrior who led armies across continents now rules from a chair by the window, wrapped in heavy furs, gazing at the same grey horizon that once carried his banners. The weight of years presses down like armour that cannot be removed. He no longer rides to war, but the war still comes to him. France, under its cunning new king, Charles V, has learned patience. The French no longer meet the English in open fields where Edward's archers can rain death from the hills. Instead, they bleed his realms slowly, striking and retreating, gnawing at his victories, one border at a time. Castles once conquered in triumph now fall like leaves in the wind. His generals send dispatches written in careful language, full of words like stalemate and strategic withdrawal. The king knows these are polite disguises for defeat. Each letter feels like a small funeral. He reads them in silence and stares at the seal of France, the fleur-de-lis, as though daring it to fade beneath his gaze. England itself, though loyal, grows restless. Taxes rise to fund the endless war, and famine flickers at the edges of the countryside. The peasants who survived the plague now know their worth and no longer bow as easily. They demand wages, land, and justice in voices that grow bolder by the year. Edward, once the architect of order, senses the foundations shifting beneath his throne. The kingdom he built from blood and brilliance is changing into something new, something he cannot entirely control, and yet he cannot hate it. In their defiance, he recognizes the same fire that once burned in his own youth, the same refusal to kneel, the same hunger for freedom. At court, his sons fill the silence that his failing voice leaves behind. John of Gaunt, ambitious and regal, rules much of England in all but name. Lionel of Antwerp governs Ireland with heavy hand and little joy. The Black Prince, his golden heir, returns to the capital, pale and sickly, his body failing after decades of war. The sight of his son, once so radiant in armour, now bent and coughing. Blood cuts Edward deeper than any blade. He spends long evenings by the prince's chamber, listening to his laboured breathing through the door, remembering the boy who had stood beside him at Cressy, whose laughter once filled the air like music. He tells himself that no father should outlive such a son. Yet Vater, ever cruel, will grant him that sorrow. In the spring of 1376, word spreads through the palace like smoke. The Black Prince is dying. Edward, though feeble, insists on being carried to Westminster to see him one last time. The journey is slow, painful, and lined with memories. When he enters the chamber, the courtiers fall silent. Father and son face each other across the narrow space. The old king trembling on his staff. The dying prince propped against pillows. For a long while, neither speaks. The air hums with the weight of all they have shared, wars won, lands lost, love unspoken. Finally, the Black Prince breaks the silence. Father, he whispers, I have done my duty to God and to England. Edward takes his son's hand, the touch fragile as parchment. And more, he answers softly, you have been the best of us. The prince smiles faintly, his lips grey, and closes his eyes. Before night falls, he is gone. The death of the Black Prince shatters something inside the king that had survived every battlefield, every loss, every betrayal. He eats little, speaks less, and seems to drift between this world and some quiet realm beyond it. The courtiers begin to rule in his name, guided by John of Gaunt, who moves through Westminster with the calm authority of a man already wearing an invisible crown. The king still signs decrees, still appears at council when his mind is clear, but more often now, his words wander into fragments of old campaigns and lost names. There are moments when he forgets which war he is fighting, or even which century he commands, yet sometimes, in flashes of fierce lucidity, he reminds everyone who he once was. One evening, a young squire makes the mistake of referring to him as our old king. Edward's eyes blaze suddenly, his voice cutting through the hall like the swing of a blade. Old, he snaps. I was old when France first knelt. I was old when Calais fell. I was old when the Black Death could not take me. And still I am here. The squire bows so low he nearly kisses the stone floor. And the court falls silent. For a moment, they see it again. The lion. Not the relic. The power that once bent nations still flickers behind his dimming eyes. But age is relentless. By the winter of 1376, he can barely stand. The weight of armour would break him now, and even the crown feels too heavy for his brow. He spends his final months at Sheen Palace, surrounded by the smell of damp wood and medicine. His rooms lit by candles that burn too low. He asks to hear the Psalms in English, the language he himself raised to the throne, and smiles faintly when the words reach him in the voice of a common priest. So, he murmurs, "It endure." Outside his chambers, England continues to breathe and change. Parliament grows bolder, the people more restless. The order he forged from chaos has evolved into something greater, something independent. The nobles who once trembled before their king now debate his taxes and question his wars. In that slow shift of power, Edward's greatest legacy quietly unfolds. He has created a realm that no longer depends on one man's strength to survive. It is a strange kind of immortality, one that humbles even him. On a mild June morning in 1377, the air unusually soft and clear, the king knows his time has come. He asks to be dressed in simple robes of white, his crown left upon the table beside his bed. The priests gather, the candles flicker, and the sound of the river murmurs through the open window. He looks once toward the east, toward Windsor, toward the grave of his queen, and whispers something only the wind can hear. Then, as the sun reaches its highest point, Edward of Windsor, conqueror of France, survivor of plague, builder of nations, breathes his last. They say that as he died, a strange calm fell over the room, a stillness so deep that even the attendants felt it in their bones. Outside, London carried on, bells rang, merchants shouted, children laughed. The world did not stop, because Edward had built a world that could continue without him. His body was carried to Westminster, and the people lined the streets in tears. They called him Edward the Great, the father of the nation, the king who endured. And in that moment, as the bells tolled across the city, he had reshaped from ruin to power. The boy who once stole back his crown from his mother's lover, who fought beside his son beneath storm clouds, who faced the plague and lived to rebuild, became more than a man. He became the memory of England itself, a reminder that greatness is not measured only in battles won, but in the world one leaves standing when the battle is over. When the tolling of the bells faded and the funeral banners were taken down, a heavy stillness settled over England, a silence that felt both proud and hollow, as if the nation itself were holding its breath in the shadow of the man it had lost. The year was 1377, and the reign of Edward III had ended after 50 years that remade the shape of the kingdom and the soul of its people. His coffin, draped in gold and crimson cloth, lay beneath the vaulted ceiling of Westminster Abbey. The candles flickered on the bronze effigy cast in his likeness stern. Patient, eternal, his hands folded over the sword that had conquered France and guarded England through plague and famine. Outside, the crowds filled the square, murmuring prayers and legends, already weaving his name into myth. But even as they mourned him, the future began to stir, a fragile and uncertain dawn rising over the ashes of his empire. The prince who would inherit his throne was no longer the shining Black Prince whose victories had made Europe tremble. That heir, beloved and brilliant, lay buried at Canterbury. The crown now passed to the Black Prince's son, a boy of 10, Richard of Bordeaux, quiet and curious, with eyes too soft for the steel that would soon be demanded of him. When he was carried into Westminster for the coronation, the courtiers bowed not to him, but to the memory of his grandfather, whose shadow fell across the hall like twilight. Edward's death had not only ended an age of conquest, but also torn open a question that no one dared to ask aloud: could England survive greatness? John of Gaunt stood beside the boy king during the ceremony, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. Tall, commanding, and handsome in a way that drew both admiration and unease, he had long been the quiet power behind the throne, and now his presence was both reassurance and warning. The people cheered for the child, but they watched John's face for cues. His eyes betrayed no emotion. He had inherited his father's strength, but not his father's restraint. And already whispers moved through the court like smoke. Would Gaunt rule in the boy's name? Or in his own England? In the years after Edward's death was a house without its builder. The wars in France sputtered on like dying fires, consuming lives and coin for victories that no longer seemed glorious. The plague returned in waves, weaker but cruelly familiar, stealing children from the cradles of men who had once buried their fathers. The old heroes of Crécy and Calais were gone or grey, replaced by younger men who wore fine armour, but carried no memory of what those banners once meant. The realm that Edward had welded together by force of will now began to drift, the iron bonds of unity loosening into uncertainty. Yet Edward's legacy was not so easily undone. His reforms had given the country bones too strong to break overnight. The courts continued to run in English. His laws still governed trade and wages, and the Order of the Garter still gathered each spring in solemn ceremony, its knights raising goblets to the absent founder. In the great chapel at Windsor, where the banners of those knights hung above the choir stalls, the wind from the Thames would sometimes slip through the open windows and stir the cloth, as if the dead king's spirit still walked among them. For all his faults, Edward had given England a heart that beat beyond his life. But the world he had known was changing faster than anyone could grasp. The plague had remade society, and the seeds of discontent sown in hardship now began to sprout in strange and dangerous forms. The peasants, once voiceless, now spoke of freedom. The craftsmen, once humble, now demanded rights. In the countryside, men gathered in secret, muttering of justice and equality, words that would have been treason in Edward's day. The taxes demanded to fund the endless wars pressed harder on their backs, and though Edward's memory was still revered, his legacy of conquest had become a burden they could no longer bear. Young Richard grew amid this tension, a child surrounded by relics of glory he could neither remember nor escape. The walls of Windsor whispered with stories of his grandfather's victories. His tutors recited chronicles of Crecy as though they were scripture, yet none of it felt real to him. He saw the cost, not the triumph, the worn faces of soldiers, the hungry eyes of farmers, the widows who knelt outside the chapel gates. "My grandfather conquered France," he once murmured. But who conquered hunger? His words were not meant for rebellion, but for reflection. Still, in them lay the first faint note of a future that would turn on its own crown. John of Gaunt tried to rule as Edward once had, but he lacked the old king's balance of fire and mercy. His wars in Spain drained England's gold, and his ambition at home stirred resentment. The Commons in Parliament began to speak with new confidence, demanding to know where the money went, daring even to question the king's advisers. The spirit of Edward's England, restless, stubborn, and proud, was waking in a form he had not foreseen. What he had built to unite his people now gave them the courage to stand against the very throne he had sanctified. Meanwhile, France, under Charles V, began to claw back what Edward had taken. Calais still held, but most of Aquitaine was lost. The once vast claim to the French crown now seemed like a fading dream, and yet the dream itself refused to die. Chroniclers continued to call Edward King of England and France in the official records, as though words alone could preserve what armies had surrendered. Even in loss, the myth endured the idea that one man's will could stretch across the sea and rewrite destiny. At night, in the abbey where he lay entombed, the torches cast long shadows over his effigy. Travellers from across Europe would come to gaze upon it, the warrior in eternal rest, the bronze folds of his robes gleaming faintly in the candlelight. Some swore that when the wind howled through the cloisters, they could hear the faint clatter of armour, as though the king still marched somewhere beyond the reach of time. To the people who passed by his tomb, Edward was no longer a man but a legend, a symbol of an age when England had been fearless, when kings rode to war with their sons beside them, when glory felt eternal. But history is cruel to eternity. The decades that followed his death were filled not with triumph, but with reckoning. Within 4 years, the great peasants' revolt would rise from the very soil that had once cheered Edward's victories. A rebellion fed by hunger and injustice. The streets of London would burn, and the young King Richard would stand face to face with men who no longer saw royalty as divine. In their fury lay both destruction and the future, the world that Edward's wars and laws had unknowingly prepared. And yet, for all the turmoil to come, the memory of Edward III remained like a steady flame in the fog, a reminder of what England could be at its best and its worst. He had not built perfection, but endurance. He had not brought eternal peace, but the will to rise again after every ruin. His empire had crumbled, but his nation had endured. So when the winter winds howled through Westminster and the banners of his old campaigns gathered dust in the rafters, there was still a kind of reverence in the silence. The people might curse the taxes, fear the wars, and question the crown, but deep in their hearts, they carried the echo of his reign, the echo of a king who had faced the full weight of time and refused to bow. And in that echo, the idea of England itself continued to breathe. The decades that followed Edward's death were like the slow fading of a song that had once shaken the earth. The melodies of conquest still lingered in the air, but the rhythm of the realm had changed. England, once united by the fire of a warrior king, now drifted between memory and uncertainty, clinging to the idea of greatness, even as the world beneath it transformed. The fields that had fed the armies of Cressy now fed a restless people who no longer bowed their heads so easily. The crown still glittered, but its weight had shifted from the head of a conqueror to the fragile brow of a boy trying to rule the ashes of an empire. Young Richard, grandson of Edward, grew up haunted by ghosts. The great hall of Westminster still echoed with tales of his forebears of Halidon Hill, of Calais, of banners fluttering in French skies, but to him they felt like distant legends, as unreachable as the stars. He was taught to believe he had inherited a throne built on divine purpose, yet the lessons of his tutors were mixed with murmurs of rebellion that slipped through the palace walls. The people spoke a new language of rights and burdens, a language born from plague and war and hardship. It was a vocabulary Edward himself had never known, and now it whispered through every marketplace and every village like an awakening dream. By 1381, that whisper turned into a roar. The taxes that funded the endless wars fell hardest on the poor, and the poor had begun to realize their strength. In the villages of Kent and Essex, men gathered in fields at dusk, their faces lit by torchlight, their voices carrying words that would have burned as treason in Edward's day. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, they cried a question that stripped centuries of hierarchy to the bone. It was not merely anger that drove them, but something far more dangerous: belief. They believed that a new order was possible, that the world could be remade, that the divine right of kings could be met with the divine right of the living. When the revolt finally came, it moved like wildfire. The peasants marched on London, an army of farmers and craftsmen, their tools turned into weapons, their banners painted with crude symbols of faith and fury. They burned tax records, broke open prisons, and demanded justice from a government that had never listened. The young king, barely 14, watched the chaos unfold from the safety of the tower. He had been raised in silks and ceremony, told that the people adored the memory of his grandfather. Now he saw their faces twisted with rage, and in that sea of defiance, the myth of Edward's England shattered like glass. Yet even in the chaos, the ghost of Edward seemed to guide his blood. Richard rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End, his armor gleaming, his youth almost radiant against the smoke-stained sky. The crowd, tens of thousands strong, fell silent when they saw him. His voice, though high and trembling, carried words that could have come from the old king himself. "You seek justice," he told them, "and by God's grace, I shall grant it." It was a moment of impossible courage, the kind that history rarely grants the young. For an instant, the mob softened, believing that the spirit of the old lion had risen again through his grandson's lips. But the peace was brief. Days later, the revolt turned violent again, and Richard was forced to act with the cunning of a ruler far older than his years. When the rebel leader, Wat Tyler, fell beneath a soldier's blade, the king rode forward, shouting above the panic, "I am your captain now. Follow me." His words saved his life, and perhaps the throne, but the victory carried the bitter taste of betrayal. The promises made in desperation were broken by morning. The leaders of the revolt were hunted down, the hangman's ropes pulled taut across the kingdom, and the people learned once again that mercy is not the language of monarchs. In those years, England began to resemble a reflection of Edward's time, but warped, distorted by the passage of grief and greed. The nobility fought among themselves, Parliament wrestled with the crown, and France, ever patient, crept back across the lost territories. The victories of the past had become the debts of the present, and every triumph carved into stone seemed to cast a longer shadow. Richard, though intelligent and imaginative, found himself drowning in a kingdom that no longer remembered how to follow. He sought beauty where his grandfather had sought battle. He built palace, sponsored poets, and surrounded himself with artists who painted a vision of England that was elegant, civilized, and unreal. The people did not understand it. They wanted strength. He offered dreams. The spirit of Edward still lingered, though no one could agree on what it meant. To the soldiers who still bore scars from France, he was the warrior saint. To the nobles, he was the symbol of authority now lost. To the peasants, he was the ghost of the world that had crushed them. Even in death, Edward ruled them all through memory. His legacy, a mirror that reflected every man's idea of power. When the chroniclers wrote of him, they no longer spoke of victories alone, but of the strange paradox. He had left behind a kingdom both strengthened and broken by its greatness. As the century turned, England changed beyond recognition. Trade grew, towns expanded, language flourished, and the seeds of something entirely new began to take root. A people who saw themselves not merely as subjects of a crown, but as a nation bound by shared identity. Edward had given them that identity, though he could never have imagined how it would grow beyond him. The English tongue he had raised to the throne became the language of poets and merchants, of preachers and rebels alike. His laws, meant to preserve order, became the tools through which future generations would demand freedom. His victories, once meant to secure obedience, had instead awakened independence. Time, that patient conqueror, continued its work. By the dawn of the 15th century, Edward's grandchildren and great-grandchildren had turned upon one another, and the crown that had once been unshakable became the prize of faction and blood. Yet through the wars that followed the rebellions, the executions, the burning cities, his name endured. Chroniclers still began their histories with him, calling his reign the Golden Age, from which all decline had begun. In truth, it was not gold that had defined it, but fire, the fire of ambition, of courage, of human will. And so, in the quiet corners of monasteries and the halls of learning, the legend of Edward III became something greater than history. He was the boy who had overthrown tyranny, the soldier who had conquered kings, the ruler who had faced pestilence and refused to bow. He was the father of chivalry and the architect of a language. His victories were gone. His empire vanished. But the idea he had forged that England could stand alone, proud and eternal, survived every ruin. In the end, perhaps that is what greatness truly means. Not the crowns that tarnish, or the walls that crumble, but the echo that endures when the world has moved on. Edward had died surrounded by silence. But that silence was only the pause before the voice of a nation began to speak for itself. Centuries would pass. Dynasties would rise and fall. And still, his name would glow in the long memory of the island he had shaped. For even when England forgot his face, it would still carry his reflection in its language, defiance, and the stubborn heartbeat of its people. Centuries would pass, and yet the name of Edward III would remain etched into the bones of England like a half-forgotten song that no generation could quite stop humming. His story, told and retold by monks, poets, and kings alike, became the measure by which greatness itself was judged. Children learned of his victories before they learned to write their own names. The fires of Crécy and the siege of Calais lived on in tapestries and chronicles, embroidered with both truth and longing. But as the centuries rolled forward, and England's crown passed through hands both noble and cruel, the man himself began to dissolve into myth, less a person, more a symbol. The boy who had once seized his throne by stealth and ruled the world by will was now a ghost haunting the conscience of his descendants. The Tudor kings, who would come long after him, claimed his blood with pride, but feared his memory. Henry VIII, who split the church and crowned himself the god of his own kingdom, kept Edward's armour polished in the royal armoury, as though to borrow his aura. He envied that balance of conquest and worship, that delicate thread between reverence and terror, which Edward had somehow woven without breaking. Elizabeth I, his distant heir in both lineage and temperament, saw in him the shadow of her own reign, a monarch who turned adversity into destiny. To her, Edward's England was the garden from which her empire grew, and she spoke of him with the calm confidence of one who knew she was walking the same line between glory and ruin. But beyond the palaces, beyond the circles of power, Edward's legend changed shape. To the common folk who still sang of him in the corners of alehouses, he was no longer the King of France or the Master of War. He was the good king, the builder, the father of English pride. In a world where the rich grew richer and the poor still bowed beneath the same burdens, his reign became a story people told to remember that once, at least once, England had seemed united beneath a single will. The words Edward's days became shorthand for a time of order and plenty, though few who used the phrase remembered the plague, the famine, the endless years of battle that had paid for that golden peace. Memory, as always, kept only the light and left the shadows for those who study history, and those who studied him found something more complex than the songs. The scholars who combed through his letters, his laws, his treaties, began to see the shape of a mind, unlike any before it strategic. Restless, sometimes merciless, yet deeply human, they saw a man who understood that power was not only a matter of swords and crowns, but of imagination. He turned war into ritual, monarchy into myth, and England into a name that meant something beyond the island's shores. He created systems that survived in Parliament. English law, the idea of a language that belonged to the people, not the conquerors. He had no vocabulary for democracy, yet he built its foundations out of necessity and instinct. But time has its own way of humbling even the greatest. The empire Edward had begun would collapse and be reborn a dozen times. The throne he made invincible would one day tremble under civil war. The longbow that had once ruled Europe would be replaced by gunpowder, and the chivalric order he founded would fade into the ceremony of a world too modern for its vows. Yet the spirit that had driven him, the faith that the will of a single man could shape the destiny of a nation, remained England's quiet obsession. Every monarch who followed, in victory or ruin, would carry a piece of his reflection, whether they knew it or not. In the age of Shakespeare, his story became theatre. The playwrights, hungry for echoes of ancient greatness, resurrected his battles and his loves, his triumphs and his griefs, turning them into poetry that could stir the blood of London crowds. The figure of the king became more than human. He became the idea of kingship itself. that strange and lonely burden of glory that demands both power and sacrifice. Through the centuries, artists painted him standing tall beneath stormy skies, his gaze fixed on the horizon of France, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword that had long since turned to rust. Even in silence, the image spoke of ambition, of faith, of the price every dreamer pays when he dares to build something larger than himself. And what, in the end, did he build? Not the empire he dreamed of? For that crumbled with the bones of his knights. Not the peace he sought, for that was devoured by time. He built, instead, something less tangible, but infinitely stronger: the imagination of a people. He gave England a story about itself, a story of courage against chaos, of endurance against despair. It was imperfect, as all myths are, but it endured because it held a truth that outlived its maker, a truth that the English, no matter their rulers or their wars, could always return to that from ruin. They could rise. When historians speak of him now, they do so with both awe and caution. They see the contradictions that make his reign so haunting: his mercy and his cruelty, his justice and his pride, his brilliance and his blindness. They see a man who redefined what it meant to rule, and in doing so, ensured that no king after him could ever escape the comparison. Even as the centuries blurred the edges of his deeds, the pulse of his reign remained alive in the veins of the nation. His tomb, cold and gleaming beneath the arches of Westminster, became less a monument to death and more a compass pointing backward toward the moment England first began to know itself. In the quiet hours of modern London, when the bells of the Abbey toll and the city hums with the ceaseless energy of life, few remember the old king who sleeps beneath their feet. Yet somewhere in the rhythm of that life, in the murmur of the Thames, in the cadence of the English tongue, in the endurance of the people who still believe in their island's destiny, his presence lingers. Time has stolen his crown, his castles, his bloodline, but not his echo. It whispers still in the air, subtle but indelible, a reminder that the story of England began not in peace, but in fire. And if one stands, late at night, in the great hall of Windsor, where the wind moans through the corridors, one might almost hear it, the faint clatter of distant hooves, the rustle of banners, the deep and steady breath of a king who refuses to fade. Edward III, the boy who took his throne in the dark, the man who ruled through war and plague, the architect of a nation that learned to speak, still stands in that silence. Not in flesh, but in the spirit that endures whenever the English heart beats against adversity. For greatness, he taught them, is not the absence of ruin. It is the courage to build again and again in its wake. And so the story ends, where all true legends begin not with a death, but with an afterlife. His empire turned to dust, his line long scattered, his victories buried beneath the centuries. And still, the dream he forged out of chaos burns quietly in the marrow of the land. Long after the crowns have tarnished and the wars have faded into history, England remembers its lion, the king who fought the darkness and taught his people that they could do the same. The king who built not merely a realm, but an idea, and through that idea became eternal.